crossroads. You know, in my opinion, it doesn't matter whether you support Trump or you support Biden. The fact of the matter is, there are a plethora of abnormalities in this election. But, you know, all that aside, it's time for people to wake up. One of the biggest, what's the word I'm looking for here? One of the biggest cons in this country has been that you can't vote for a third party, because if you vote for a third party, you're voting against your party. Well, look at it this way here. If 50% of the Democrats, let's say liberals like myself, vote against the progressive Democrat in choice of the liberal third party candidate, most likely a libertarian, and 50% of the actual liberals in the Republican Party who identify with the Republican Party because they understand they're not progressives in the modern term, but they don't identify with the radical views of the hard right fringe of the Republican Party, just like at least half of us in the Democrat Party don't identify with the hard left fringe, then the third party gets power. Or at least the third party gets in there and starts putting on the brakes. Because the fact of the matter is, most Americans are liberal. The Constitution is the most liberal document ever devised to lead a country. Our founding fathers were Democratic Republicans. A Democratic Republican is a liberal. The Constitution is a liberal document. Ironically, when you look at modern progressives aren't even progressive. They're socialist. They're a socialist, communist, fascist, melding, molding, mixing of all these different ideologies that have nothing to do with progressivism, liberalism, or even conservatism. Most liberals actually have more in common with conservatives. In the American viewpoint, conservatives are strict religious, theological driven. And that's not really the case, because most people look at Reagan, for example, as a conservative. And Reagan wasn't a conservative. Reagan was a true classic liberal. Now, granted, he had his faults, but that's besides the point. The fact of the matter is, Reagan was the exact example of a true classic liberal. John F. Kennedy was a true liberal. Had his faults, but he was a liberal. He led the country the way a liberal would lead the country. Ronald Reagan led the country the way a liberal would lead the country. Calvin Coolidge led the country the way a liberal would lead the country. I would argue that Trump actually led the country the way a liberal would lead the country. Each of these presidents have their own faults, but the fact of the matter is, they are the only examples of a liberal being in power that we have. And the irony is, when you look at Trump, Reagan, John F. Kennedy, and Calvin Coolidge, those are the only examples you can look at where things actually were running right in the country. Those are the only examples we have of a non-chaotic period in the country. I mean, yeah, we had the whole segregation movement going on, which again, John F. Kennedy led that on the government side. Granted, you had Malcolm X when he was younger, and you had John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, you had the Rosa Parks, there was plenty of people in the world that, weren't in government that were leading that movement, but John F. Kennedy is the only example of a liberal that actually led that. And ironically, it was Republicans who backed them up. Which goes back to what a progressive was classically. The progressive movement had nothing to do with socialism, had nothing to do with communism, had nothing to do with fascism, had nothing to do with anti-capitalism, none of that. The original progressive movement actually was getting to the heart of what liberalism is, because they took hold of the Constitution and said it was time to start embracing what the Constitution means and start empowering what the Constitution was meant to do. That's why the women's suffrage movement started as a progressive movement. That was a progressive movement. The very first progressive president to actually really on a federal stage address slavery. That was a progressive movement. That came out of the Republican Party. Somewhere along the line, the socialists, the communists, the fascists, the anarchists, they all figured out how to hijack the parties. And they started with the Liberal Party, Democrats. And they managed to branch over because they're well entrenched in the Republican Party as well. We really only have a one-party system. Whether you want to admit it or not, we really only have a one-party system with people in there that still believe in the Constitution, that are trying to keep these two parties in check, but they can't. Because it's only these radical fringe that have been infiltrated. That's the irony to it all. It's the radical fringe that has the most infiltration. And that's why it's only the radical fringe that can keep power. A lot of people the Civil War. Most people think the Civil War was actually over slavery. It wasn't over slavery, it was over taxes. The problem is, the false truth to this narrative that it was over slavery comes from the fact that the Civil War was actually led in general by 3 states. And those 3 states were the 3 states that actually wanted to keep slavery. Mississippi, North Carolina, and I believe it's Alabama. I could be wrong about the Alabama. It could be Georgia, but I'm pretty sure it was Alabama. But most states actually got involved with the Civil War in the South over the whole problem with taxes. Same problem that the whole country was founded on to begin with. This whole country was founded over a war over taxes. The Civil War was actually fueled by a tax debate. And 3 states that did not want slavery abolished managed to take that narrative and they hijacked the war. This whole it's a false truth about the Civil War being fueled by slavery. And like I said, that false truth comes out of the fact that you had 3 states that led the Civil War, because those were the 3 states with the most power and the most money. North Carolina, Mississippi, and I'm pretty sure it was Alabama. I gotta look back on this, but I'm pretty sure it was Alabama. They had the funds to put the Civil War into play. But the Civil War as a whole had nothing to do with slavery. That's why even Lincoln didn't even decide to do anything about the Emancipation Act until they were losing the Civil War. And his treasurer explained to him, if we lose the Civil War and the South secedes from the United States, we're finished as a country, because the United States cannot operate without the taxes that we are bringing in the form of tariffs at that time, from the South. If the South seceded, there was no way for the North to continue operating. The North ran off of taxes that were being brought in from the South in the form of tariffs. The irony is, most people don't realize it because of this false narrative of the war being over slavery. But the fact of the matter is, slavery would have been abolished in the South over a matter of time. Most states in the South were just as appalled by slavery as Lincoln. That was something that they did agree with Lincoln on, was the whole appallment to slavery. Doesn't mean that, you know, I'll admit, at that point in time, like Lincoln, most of them were bigots. There were very few racists. Most of them were bigots. They didn't like black people. But they were appalled by slavery. They did not feel they were better than black people. They just did not like black people. That is the difference between racism and bigotry. Bigotry, you just don't like somebody because of their race, creed, sex, religion, so on and so forth. But it does not mean, like the Spanish Inquisition, that was a form of religious bigotry. Modern day Islamic extremists, they are bigots. They do not like the idea of other people being in another religion. They do not like their religion. So they do not like the people of that religion. That is bigotry. Most people don't know Lincoln was a bigot. He did not like black people. He planned on deporting all of my forefathers. Yeah, we can actually trace my family heritage not only to tribal royalty amongst the Ramapo and Lenape, but we can also trace my family heritage back to slave ships. We can also trace my family heritage to Spanish royalty, Spain, Portugal royalty. My family, I got a very diverse family history. I love my family history. We're still working on figuring out all of that. But, yeah. My family tree is made of royalty and slaves. Go figure. But I don't think the Civil War ever really ended. And we're looking at the outcome. A lot of you are going to say, no, the North won the Civil War. We won the quote-unquote war. It doesn't mean the war ever actually ended. I really think the Knights of the Golden Circle were the ones that figured out how to infiltrate the progressive movement, and from there it all became what we see as the progressive movement today. And a lot of you are going to say, well, no, I don't see Confederates really embracing fascism and socialism and communism. Why not? The Knights of the Golden Circle, their power came from the three main states that were fueling the war to keep people in control. To control people the way they wanted to control them. I really believe that's what our modern progressive the progressive system that we see today, that's where it all roots back to. It's still just another form of slavery. Progressives have intentionally kept the whole race war alive. You know, Malcolm X, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and in all honesty, most of the people that actually started the whole civil rights movement, they were against affirmative action. And the reason they were against affirmative action was because, like myself, they're appalled by the fact that somebody's actually going to get up there and say, well, you're too stupid to make it on your own, so we need to rig the system for you. That is racism and bigotry. Some of it's fueled by racism, some of it's fueled by bigotry. But the affirmative action system, that's why they were so much against it. It's all about racism and bigotry. It's a bunch of people getting up there and saying, you're too stupid because of your racial makeup to do this on your own. It's quite appalling, actually. My grandfather was dead set against that as well. But it comes down to most Americans today, we don't believe what these progressives posing as liberals and conservatives believe. We believe we're all equal. I mean, the fact of the matter is, especially my generation, most of us didn't grow up in depending on where you grew up, most of us didn't grow up in a segregated environment. We don't understand the hate of racists and bigots that the David Dukes and Al Sharptons of the world all embrace. Because I grew up going to school as somebody who's Caucasian, Negro, and Native American. I have no concept of growing up. Well, I can't say that because after Al came to town, I learned what segregation was about. But prior to Al coming to town, when I grew up in Liberty, New York, I lived in a neighborhood where we had Koreans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Caucasians, Negroes, people from India, and, you know, people like Germans, Russians, all living in the same neighborhood, on the same street. Al came to town, and next thing I know, everybody's moving to the Caucasian section, the Negro section, the Puerto Rican section, the Korean section, the Mexican section. I didn't fit in anywhere. And I fit in everywhere. I mean, it was kind of ironic. I really didn't fit in anywhere, but because of that, I fit in everywhere. I didn't fit in with the extremists. You know, whether they're the Al Sharpton bigots, the David Duke bigots, the Mao bigots, the pick your race bigots. I didn't fit in with them, but fortunately they were only the fringes at that time. So I pretty much fit in with everybody. I was able to go anywhere in town and I fit in. But our politicians, it seems like somehow they grew up in this bubble of segregation. I don't know if it's because of when they went to college, colleges were segregated. I didn't go to college, so I don't know. Maybe colleges were segregated, so they grew up in this segregated mindset. So somehow they think that the rest of us are all segregated the way, or maybe they grew up in segregated neighborhoods. I don't know. I don't understand why they think the country is so segregated. I didn't grow up in that. And everywhere I've lived has never been, well, except for Grahamsville, New York, everywhere I've ever lived has always been a diverse culture. Grahamsville, New York was a anomaly. But even then, you'd be amazed how much that was all done in secret. I mean, it was an open secret. Everybody knew about it. You know, growing up there, you know, you didn't go to school and say, I'm actually a Native American Negro. You know, no, they knew better. You know, I'm white. You know, just knew better. But at the same time, with my closest friends, they all knew. I mean, It wasn't something I was ashamed of. It was just the understanding that, you know, Saturday night you can go up on the back roads in the mountain into Claryville and you can see the big cross back in the woods burning. It was a part of the culture there. I don't believe it's like that anymore, but there was a time when it was like that. And that's really the only place I ever lived where that was a reality until, like I said, until Al came to town. Spewing his hate, tore our town apart, set us back 100 years. Actually, set us back more than 100 years. Sullivan County was a racially diverse county for well beyond that, well before that. The very first black fireman comes from Sullivan County from the 1800s. So, you know, Sullivan County was always, until Al came to town, Sullivan County was always open to everybody being equal. There was always an undertow there that, you know, sometimes they had to do things to get around it. For example, our Monticello, New York is Sullivan County. The very first black fireman in the United States came from there. But they had to title him as a janitor because there was still, you know, but enough people, more people embraced a racially diverse community than were against it. But unfortunately, just like today, the people that want to keep everybody segregated are the ones that were still in, that keep getting in power. So, you know, it's just time for us to stop embracing these politicians who, for whatever reason, want to keep embracing all this hate and control and imprisonment, and start embracing statesmen. If we had statesmen in power, the wonderful George Bush would have never got the atrociously unconstitutional Patriot Act through. There is nothing constitutional about the Patriot Act. If we had statesmen in power, Obama, with the help of John Roberts, would have never got the unconstitutional, atrociously unconstitutional Obamacare through. If we had statesmen in power, Obamacare would have looked completely different. Obama, you know, when I voted for Obama, I thought I was voting for a statesman. And when he was talking about fixing our medical insurance, I thought he was talking about doing away with things like the unconstitutional act of the pre-existing medical loopholes that allow insurance companies not to insure people. I had no idea that, you know, he was going to go in and destroy our whole medical system. That wasn't what I voted for. I voted for the rights of people that, you know, they have pre-existing medical conditions And so they couldn't get their insurance renewed after they were found to have that condition. Obamacare is just with Statesmen, that would have never went through. If Nancy Pelosi really believed in what she was out there preaching, she would have never backed Obamacare. If Obama believed in what he was preaching, they would have never backed Obamacare. If Hillary Clinton believed what she was preaching, she would have never backed the Patriot Act. If George Bush II believed what he was preaching, he would have never even proposed the Patriot Act. And most of these problems that all these laws have created, they don't even have to be overturned. If we had statesmen instead of politicians, the Patriot Act would go away in the next funding bill. That's all it is. It's just funding. All they need to say is, no, we're not going to fund that anymore, and the Patriot Act goes away. All they need to say is, no, we're not going to fund that anymore, and Obamacare goes away. All they need to say is, no, we're not going to fund that anymore, and all the Johnson-era laws that created the paramilitary police force that we're being forced to live under, and that police are being forced to enforce, would all go away if we had statesmen in power. Because it's all funding. All these laws that are creating all this turmoil are they're all funded. None of them are actually in law in a way that it's all about funding. Get rid of the funding, and all these unconstitutional and all these intrusions in our privacy and all these intrusions on the American populace, and even for the police. All these things that the police are being forced by politicians to do and create all this animosity between them and us, it all goes away. Just by statesmen getting in power and saying, no, we're not going to fund this